Hello everyone, Dr. West here. Welcome to Unit 3. We are just about finished with this course. So what we are going to be talking about in Unit 3 is sort of a larger collection of different behaviors, which again is the entire point of the class. That's why we call it Brain and Behavior. So we're going to be talking a lot more about types of behaviors and then how those behaviors either influence the brain or are influenced by different things that are happening within the brain. Specifically, in these first set of lectures, we're going to be talking about several different things that are included in Chapter 12. We're going to talk about motivated behaviors, emotion, and reward and control. And maybe upon first glance, it doesn't necessarily seem like those go together, but actually they're a lot more related than you might think. But before we jump into this, specifically Chapter 12, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to step back. I'm going to discuss a little bit of the big picture for Unit 3. So we're going to look quickly together at that part of the syllabus and kind of the schedule. That's just how my brain works. I like to have a big picture of things. And then I'm also going to quickly jump over to the study guide before returning to the material here. So let's do that together, and then we will come back here together. Okay, so here we are looking at the information from the syllabus. First thing I noticed is that I have a slight typo here. This should be the Unit 3 study guide, but we are going to look at it together. But again, hopefully you figured that out. But hopefully you've been doing that all along. It is going to be where you would typically find it, which is on the very first module slide for Unit 3. So you're going to go in, go to Module 3.1. You will find the study guide as you have been finding it. And hopefully what you see is that is, again, how I want you to decide what information that I am presenting or somebody else is presenting is what I want you to learn versus what is just extra stuff that we are using to either help you remember it or that we're sort of prepping you for if you were going to move forward to take another class. And that could either be 3116 or 3113, something like that in the future. Because again, we don't want to just give you the stuff here. We sort of do want to make the bigger picture. But at the same time, I don't want to completely overwhelm you either. So I do want to say, yes, here is the overall picture, but within that, I want you to know exactly this and this and this. So do make sure you're using those study guides. Okay. So from Chapter 12, we're going to be looking at these three topics. We're going to look at motivated behavior, emotion, reward, and control. And what you're going to see is that underlying motivated behaviors is not just the need to survive. There is also sort of this idea of emotion. Sometimes our emotions drive our behaviors. And I'll give you a very obvious example of that, right? They typically make fun of this in romantic comedies or something, right? Like somebody will be sad, maybe they just got broken up with or something like that. And there's the stereotypical, oh, well, I'm just going to go eat a big thing of ice cream and sit on the couch, right? That's kind of the idea here of emotion is driving a behavior. So that's sort of the link that we'll talk about. We'll talk about sort of the brain structure and the idea behind that. And then we'll also talk about the idea of how reward feeds into all of this, right? Like if something isn't rewarding, if it doesn't feel good to do it, you're probably not going to keep doing it. But if it does feel good to do it, you probably are going to keep doing it. And then what you're going to do, and what I'm going to tell you to do, is sort of hang on to this idea, hang on to this thought, because we're going to come back to it in our very last lecture when we're talking about drugs and drug use behavior. And again, not necessarily legal drugs, but illegal substances and why somebody might become addicted to a substance per se. Because one of the theories of why people become addicted is that this reward motivated behavior sorts of kind of thing kind of gets hijacked by the drugs, right? And taken over. And that's why you're continually seeking out the drugs. Some other things that we're going to cover in this particular unit, we're going to talk about a little bit more about how you think, the idea of kind of thinking, memory, learning. A lot of that stuff is generically called cognitive or cognition. And so we're going to do a little bit of all that together here. Again, this is sort of setting you up, again, if you're going to go on towards taking like 3116. And then we're going to take one more step back and we're going to talk about a couple other really interesting behaviors that are driven by biological processes. So we're going to talk about the idea of rhythms again, and you heard a little tiny bit about this in Unit 2 because we were talking a little bit about the hormone releases and some things like that. We mentioned melatonin, for example, with sleepiness and sleep. We are going to specifically talk about sleep itself. It's actually a lot more complex than just going to bed, your brain turns off, you get up, your brain turns back on. That's actually not at all how it works. So we'll talk about sleep and what's happening during the brain. And then, as I said, then we will finish with talking about drugs and how drugs impact your behavior, and then actually almost hijack your behavior so that your behavior is fully focused on seeking out more drugs. So that's sort of where we will end for this semester. Again, you can see, you can see the chapters that I'm going to be pulling from. Mostly chapter 12, 15, 14, 13. I'm kind of reversing the order of these just because in my brain that's how it made sense. But then, as I said, I left this out earlier in the semester from chapter 6, the part about drugs and behavior, because I really wanted to present a lot of this stuff first, as well as some of the cognitive stuff, because another thing that goes into this idea of drug use and drug-seeking behavior is also some of the cognitive parts of your brain sort of get hijacked, right? Like you can say, I know this is not good for me, and yet you're going to want to use the drug anyway. So that's why I wanted to wait until we covered some of that before we jumped into that. So that's a generic overview of what we're going to do in Unit 3. So now let's jump back into our actual first lecture. Okay, so let's jump into it. Now, I know I said I was going to go over the study guide, and I will, but I think it's going to be a benefit to maybe do that at the end of these first set of lectures. So then as you're studying the stuff that I'm going to talk about here, so motivated behaviors, emotion, reward, at the end of this last one that I'll do, because I'm going to divide this up into 3 sort of smaller lectures, then I'll go over the study guide so that you can kind of see, okay, here's what I talked about, but then here's exactly what I want you to know. So I'm going to save that. So let's jump straight into it. So this first one is going to mostly just cover motivated behaviors. Then I'll pause so these don't get too ridiculously long. I'll make a second one on emotion and then a third one on reward and control. But I do, again, because they're going to kind of flow together, I want to give a couple definitions. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is the difference between an emotion and how is that related to motivation? An emotion is just a relatively brief episode of responses in your body. And I say it that way because there's actually several things that occur. You actually get physical body responses, right? You get things that are happening within your body system, things that you may feel your body do. You also might have outward expressions like on your face, for example. So if you think about a time that you've been really happy, right? You may do something as simple as smiling even, or an emotion of anger, right? You may have your eyebrows go a certain way and you may clench your fists, right? So we have all of these body responses they do. So again, it's synchronized responses that indicate that you have evaluated some sort of event. And that event can be something internal that happened. So you can evaluate like, oh, I don't think I liked that. That made me feel sad. That made me feel angry. Or that makes me feel scared. Or, ooh, what is that pain? That's not a good pain. Uh-oh, what's going on, right? Or some external event. Like, hey, Dr. West just said we're going to have, another extra credit. Woohoo! That makes me happy, right? Or Dr. West said we're not going to have any extra credit. Now I'm mad, or now I'm sad, or now I'm scared, or whatever it is. So again, an emotion is just an evaluation of what's happening in the world, again, either internally or externally, and then all of the ways that your body will coordinate to respond, including, right, the cognitive part of it. The cognitive piece means the thought process of how you actually feel about it. So the kind of like the label that you give to it. Oh, that made me feel happy. That made me feel sad. That made me feel angry. That made me feel confused. All of that is sort of blended together and we call that emotion. Now, it's related in some ways to the idea of motivation. Motivation is how likely you are to act, right? So basically, it also involves some emotion. And another word for emotion is your affective response. Your affect is your emotional expression or your emotion at the time. There are some disorders where it disrupts your affect. For example, schizophrenia is one that sometimes people will display inappropriate affect, is usually how it's worded. So sometimes they will be happy when they shouldn't be, or sad when they shouldn't be, or angry when they shouldn't be, or they will have no emotional expression at all when you should have some emotional expression. And again, that's just one example, but just to give you an idea, that's what the word affective means. So motivation, again, is just how likely you are to act, right? And again, that is also sort of related to the emotion that you're feeling, right? If you're feeling super mad, right, you're a lot more likely to go and do something than if you're not super mad. How likely are you to honk your horn at somebody in traffic? Well, if they've just made you super angry, you're a lot more motivated to honk your horn or do some other inappropriate gesture, right? If they haven't done anything, or if you didn't get mad about it, right? If they did do something, if you didn't get mad about it, if you just didn't care, because you're like, yeah, whatever, you are probably going to be less motivated to do some of those things. So they sort of kind of work together. So emotions are classified along the dimension of motivation. So a component of emotional reaction, right, is your motivation to approach an object, approach an event, approach a situation, or to withdraw from it, or to just kind of leave it alone would be in the middle. All right, so you kind of have two ends of a spectrum. One end would be I want to go to that object, get that object, that event, that situation, be in it, do it. The other end would be I want to stay away from it, never have anything to do with it. And then the middle would be don't really care one way or the other. Right? So some of the approach emotions would be happiness, right? So if something makes you really happy, like your friends, you're probably gonna want to go hang out with them. Surprise, anger, right? Again, somebody makes you angry, you're probably gonna want to go get up in their face, right? Other ones, withdrawal emotions, sadness, right? If somebody makes you sad, you're probably not going to want to hang out with them again. If something makes you scared, like for me with spiders, I don't want to hang out with spiders. I don't want to get anywhere near spiders. I don't want to go to places like basements where there might be spiders. And I said might, there doesn't even actually have to be a spider there. So I'm going to have, based on my withdrawal, a motivation, in this case, to not go into a basement. And then again, if you don't really care, you're going to be somewhere in the middle. So if it doesn't produce a strong emotion, right, it's also not going to have a really strong motivation one way or the other. Hopefully that makes sense. A little bit now too about the idea of deprivation. So we talked a little bit, or you heard a little bit about being deprived of things when we were talking about pain. And we said that emotional pain is processed in your brain exactly the same way as physical pain, right? So this is why bullying is such a problem. This is why emotional abuse is such a problem, even though it is not nearly recognized as much as it needs to be yet. I think at least we're starting to turn a corner because some of the research is finally being able to back up what we've been saying for years, which is this is a big deal, right? Because we could see kind of the long-term effects of it, but now we're being able to show in the moment why it's a big deal. And it's a big deal because your brain is processing pain, whether it's emotional or physical, in the same way. Well, what we also know is that there are some other things that sort of happen that way too, right? Your brain needs stimulation. Your brain does not like to be deprived of incoming sensory information for too long a period of time. You know, a little bit probably does feel good, and it can actually feel pretty relaxing, especially because we live in a world where we are constantly bombarded. So I'm not talking about short little breaks. What I'm talking about is a long period of sensory deprivation. And again, we have this need, right, to feel something, or we feel out of place if we're not getting sensory input. And that's because our brains have evolved, right, so that we are constantly responding to our environment. We are scanning our environment, looking for things that could potentially be dangerous, looking for things that could potentially be rewarding, so things like food, friends, things like that. But when we do engage with the environment, that stimulates our brain, right? If you think about all that sensory stuff we just did in the last unit, right? When you look at something, it sends information to the brain. When you hear something, it sends information to the brain. When you touch something, it sends information to the brain. The brain puts all that together, helps you to remember it, and then if you need to act on it, it sends information back out so you can act on it. So again, all of that incoming information and then outgoing information is just keeping your brain stimulated and activating. And that feels rewarding to you. That's partly why we think cell phones, TV, and certain kinds of things like that can kind of get addictive in a way. I mean, that's maybe too strong of a word, although maybe not, right? But because that kind of stimulation, incoming information like that, right, feels good to your brain. Your brain doesn't like to just sit there. But that's also why if sometimes you're sitting there and you're feeling bored and you're not getting a lot of sensory information going in, your brain will maybe just kind of start to wander, and you might do something like daydream, right? Because again, your brain is basically just wanting to entertain itself. It likes to be stimulated, and if something external is not doing it, your brain will stimulate itself because that also can feel rewarding. But again, is there actually pain associated with it when you're not giving your brain the sensory input that it needs or the stimulation that it needs? So what happens when you're deprived of something like your cell phone? Well, again, you actually feel at least stress, right? We know that some people will even say it feels like a part of my body's missing, right? It's almost painful not knowing if I got a text or an email or a call or something. Like, I feel bad. Like, have you ever done that? You've gone to class or you've gone somewhere and you left your phone in the car and you knew you didn't have time to go get it, right? Now, I've known people that have actually like skipped class to go back and get their cell phone, and that's a whole different thing. But when you really legit can't go get your phone, right, it feels weird. And I'm going to admit it, I'm one of those. It feels really weird to not have my cell phone. And I've even had times where I've had my cell phone and I haven't had it in my back pocket, and I swear I have felt like it was vibrating in my back pocket. It's almost like I'm having phantom cell phone some kind of thing. And again, that's not a legitimate recognized thing yet. But again, I swear I felt that, right? In other words, it's almost like you can be addicted to your phone. And because of that, it hurts, or at least it's uncomfortable when you don't have it. Why? Well, because your brain is begging you for it. Just like your brain would beg you for other sensory input, and just like your brain would beg you for some of the other things that we're going to talk about in the next couple lectures. Your brain will beg you for food if you haven't given it enough food. Your brain will beg you for water if you don't have enough fluid in your body. Right? Your brain will beg you for attention, social interaction, if you feel like you haven't gotten enough of that. And then again, if you don't get those needs met, right, your body itself will suffer. So yeah, it's a real thing. Being deprived can cause real, actual problems. But let's go back to the senses for a minute, because I promised you in the last unit that I had not forgotten that we actually had more senses than we were going to cover. And I had told you that I was purposefully going to temporarily skip the two chemical senses, which is taste and smell. And the reason I decided to skip them is because hopefully by now you've learned that pattern that we talk about. Taste and smell, for the most part, still follow that same pattern, but I'm going to bring them in here, because they are also very much related to some of these other concepts that we're going to be talking about, motivated type behaviors. So let's kind of jump into that. So one of the things that we know is that some stuff just smells good. So think about your favorite food in the entire world for just a minute. Even close your eyes and do it. Think about your favorite food and then think about what that favorite food smells like. Right, so for me, I have two choices that I'm kind of going between. It's usually some kind of Italian food. For now, I'm just going to pick pizza, but like like a real homemade pizza with real mozzarella cheese. And I'm going to smell what that smells like with the fresh basil on it and the fresh tomatoes, right? Or my other favorite is any kind of cookie that has just come out of the oven and is still hot, right? So it's kind of still gooey and warm. Chocolate chip is always a good option, but I'm not picky. I'll pretty much eat any kind of cookie that comes out of the oven. All right, so think about what that smells like, right? Just imagining what something can smell like actually will send out an entire set of signals in your body, right? That's how strong your sense of smell is. You didn't even actually have to smell it. You just had to think about what it might have smelled like because you've smelled it in the past, right? To start feeling something emotionally, but also to have your body getting ready just in case, all right? Because your body's kind of hoping like, ooh, maybe she really is going to make cookies, or maybe she really does have pizza, or whatever your favorite food was that you just imagined. Right? So let's talk about smell for just a second here. Smell is based on the idea of chemical signals. We just call them chemo signals. We're not super creative, right? And again, that's what you're detecting. That's the energy that's out in the world. It's just chemicals that are in the air or in whatever it is that you put in your mouth. Now, hopefully you're only putting foods and liquids in your mouth. But again, there have been some unfortunate times where, like I've sprayed something like hairspray or something like that, and then accidentally something got in my mouth and it got on my tongue, and that was super gross, right? So again, sometimes other stuff accidentally gets in your mouth, but for the most part, stuff gets in the air. It sort of floats around in the air. You sniff it when you're breathing in. Sometimes you sniff it on purpose. Sometimes you're just breathing and it happens to go in. And then with the mouth, again, also detecting chemo signals or chemical signals, you take stuff into your mouth when you're eating or drinking, or just when your mouth happens to be open. Sometimes you even breathe through your mouth, and so stuff can go in that way. And that plays a central role in some forms of motivated and emotional behavior. Right? Now, historically speaking, evolutionarily speaking, right, the sense of smell was super important, right, to most animals. Most of our mammal species, most of our mammal cousins, actually it's still really important. I think we talked earlier about how dogs and rats and some other species still rely a lot more heavily on smell than humans do. And humans are actually pretty good at detecting smell. We just don't really rely on it anymore. We don't really train ourselves. We don't really work on it a whole lot. Probably some of our more ancient ancestors were even better than we are. Unfortunately, it's hard to really know that because a lot of what we have left is just the skeletal remains. We don't have any of the soft tissue to have gotten a better sense of it. But again, very likely, given what we know from some of kind of looking at the evolution of other mammal species, it's a lot likely that some of our more ancient ancestors had a better sense of smell even than we do. But why is smell so important? Well, it can help you identify your group members. It can help you identify who is known and who is unknown. Right? In other words, right, whether you know it or not, you can usually recognize somebody that you know from their smell. Right? I'll give you an example of this that happened pretty recently at my house. So I live with my husband and my daughter. My daughter is 7, and my husband has a brother who lives in Maine. And during the fishing season, which is actually right now, my brother-in-law is a lobster fisherman. So he goes out, brings in the lobsters, sells them, blah, 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 blah. But obviously you can't necessarily, at least he can't, he doesn't have the big enough boat and equipment to do that year round. So about November-ish, he shuts down his boat for the year. And from November until about March, he doesn't work because, again, his equipment isn't strong enough to go out into basically the frozen water, the cold water, the deep water, and pull up the lobsters, because the lobsters go really, really, really far out during the winter. And again, this is more than you ever wanted to know about lobster. But the point of the story is that actually on a fairly regular basis, my brother-in-law will come down once he's pulled his boat out of the water for the year, and he will live with us for a few months in the winter and work for my husband, who owns a construction company. Which is actually great for everyone, because then my brother-in-law basically has a job and my husband has an extra employee, and it just works out really nice. But we just let him live here. We have a spare bedroom on the other side of the house, and we just kind of let him live here. But also, we just kind of act like one big family, and so we will share things. We share meals. Like, we don't make him get his own stuff and all like that. So some other things that we also share is we share the laundry room. And what we decided is it makes a lot more sense that instead of waiting for him to have enough stuff to wash his own load of laundry, that what we would do is we would just take all of their nasty, yucky work clothes and wash them all together. And so basically what we do in our laundry room is I have one basket where all the nasty work clothes go, and then one basket for anything else that's not nasty and yucky. So again, it can still be their clothes. It's just ones that they haven't worn when, they're crawling up under somebody's house, or they're fixing somebody's toilet, or whatever it is that they're doing. And what's really funny, and it happened, is that I was folding some laundry, and this was after my brother-in-law had left to go home this past time, again, to start up his lobster fishing season. And I pulled out a t-shirt out of the laundry, and I didn't recognize it. It didn't look like one of my husband's, but again, he and his brother are just about the same size, so they wear about the same size clothes. And I was like, I think this is one of my brother-in-law's shirts. And so I smelled it, even though it had been washed. So even though it had already been cleaned, even though it had already been used in the same soaps and all that stuff, and yet I could still tell, just based on the smell, that it was not my husband's, because they smell different. The two men smell different. And again, that was a super really long way to say humans are still capable of this. Some people are better at it than others. And again, I am one of the very rare individuals. I have a really strong sense of smell. So I can tell stuff like that. Like, I can tell when my daughter is sick almost immediately because her breath smells a certain way, and I can say, oh, you got a sinus infection, right? Like, I'll take her to the doctor 2 or 3 days before she's really, really bad, because she has a certain smell. But again, we can detect that. We have these chemo signals. So again, we can detect things like who is and who is not part of our group. Humans don't do this quite as much, at least not anymore, but dogs, cats, other creatures definitely will do this. They'll mark their territory using scent. We can also identify our favorite foods or forbidden foods, foods that we either shouldn't eat or don't want to eat, foods that we don't like to eat. So I can tell you I hate the smell of cabbage that's cooking, because I do not like eating cooked cabbage. And you can't trick me with Brussels sprouts, because those are just little baby cabbages, even though they're not. Don't trick me. That's what they taste like, and that's what they smell like. And you can form associations among smells and tastes, but particularly smells, right, with emotional events. And I'm going to tell you why that is later in the lecture. So we know that odor and taste play a fundamental role in your biology, especially for your emotion and motivated behavior. And it's because of this part that I'll tell you in a minute, which is what makes these two particular sensory things even more influential than some of the others for motivated behavior, which is why I saved these two. I mean, yeah, if you see something that looks good, right, you're going to be motivated. Like, oh, I see that bread over there. That bread looks good. But if you smell the bread, it's going to be even more powerful, especially if you can combine the smell with the sight. But sometimes you don't even have to see it. You can just smell it, and you're going to be even more motivated. So that's why, again, I saved these two sensory systems for this chapter about motivated behavior. So quickly, we're going to go through these two sensory systems. Again, I'm not going to give you quite as much detail as I did in the previous unit on sensory systems, but I am going to sort of go through the pattern. So here's a picture of both really quick. So again, here's your nose and your sense of smell here. Here is your mouth, which includes your tongue, which is where you will find the receptors for your sense of taste. Again, both of them are ultimately going to send information to the brain. So your tongue is ultimately going to send information up into the brain. This way, your nose, the smell will go up in here into your sinus cavities, will ultimately be detected here. Here's that olfactory bulb that I mentioned earlier that's actually fairly small in humans, but that is like huge in rats. And then ultimately that information will get sent to the brain as well. They get processed sort of in similar areas in the brain. We'll talk about that too in just a second. But again, the basic idea is this. Air comes into your nose, and then again, sometimes air can come into your mouth, but actually still make it to your nose. So sometimes even when you're just breathing through your mouth, you can actually still smell something because, again, the air doesn't always just go down into your lungs for breathing. Sometimes some of the air backs up into your sinuses that way, and it can still interact here and help you to smell. Again, taste, something goes into your mouth. You kind of mash it across your tongue, either on purpose or on accident or whatever is just part of the eating. And then all the food and all the chemical that's in that food will go down into these little grooves, these little taste bud pores that are on your tongue. All right, and will interact with receptors that are there, and then that information gets sent to the brain. So again, that's the overall picture of what's going on. So now we're going to pick them apart. I'm going to start with smell. So again, smell is picking up chemicals in the air that we breathe that are dissolved ultimately in the mucus that's in your nose or in your nasal cavity, and that interacts with the cilia that are in there. It activates a metabotropic receptor, which has a specific G protein coupled opening. Again, that's one of those ones where it has a metabotropic receptor. When the chemical that's in the air binds with it, it releases a second protein that goes and opens a sodium channel, and that's what causes the action potential. So again, here's like the bone, you're at the top of your nasal cavity. You've got all of this at the top of your, basically the skin at the top of your nose. We call it nasal epithelium. You've got the somas or the cell bodies with their specialized dendrites hanging out. You've got your sinus cavity here with all the air coming through it and all these little chemicals that are dissolved in here. All right. Should a chemical happen to bind with a receptor, right, again, it causes that G protein coupled receptor to release something, which then goes and opens a second channel, which lets some sodium in. That causes ultimately an action potential to happen. And then here are the dendrites. Excuse me. Here are the axons. These are the dendrites. This is the very end of a dendrite down here. Here are the axons that are ultimately going to take that action potential and send it up towards the brain. Again, it goes first into this olfactory bulb, and then ultimately it will head towards the brain, towards a brain region called the piriform cortex. So hopefully you get sort of the idea there. We are still following the same type pattern. We have the receptors. We're ultimately going to send it to the brain. So the olfactory pathway, and I got several things that I want to show you here, and I'm going to move some stuff in order to do that. So give me just a second. But again, the olfactory receptors cells project to the olfactory bulb. Sometimes these olfactory receptor cells are called hair cells. I just always am careful when I say that because people think, oh, I got hair in my nose. Those are the receptors. No, that's not it. Those are legit just hair in your nose. And they serve a variety of functions. Partly they serve to keep stuff from going up in your nose, right? That's kind of why you get boogers, which is gross, I understand. But at the same time, that's also good because that means that it kept dirt and other stuff from going in, and then further was trapped by mucus and then hardened so that it didn't actually get into your body. So that's more like a safety mechanism, almost even part of your immune system to keep stuff out. No, these are tiny little microscopic things that are even further up in your nose that you can't just see necessarily by looking. Again, also called hair cells because they kind of look like hair cells, but they will ultimately get into the brain. But notice this, remember what would have been our pattern? We would have said receptor, thalamus, primary sensory cortex, secondary sensory cortex, association cortex. But the olfactory system cheats. The olfactory system doesn't go to the thalamus first. It eventually gets there, right? But it doesn't go there first. In fact, some information doesn't go there at all. Some of the olfactory targets go straight to the amygdala and to the piriform cortex. It doesn't even go through the thalamus. Right? And remember, amygdala was processing emotions, which is really why you can have smells linked with emotions. If you've ever smelled a smell and thought of an emotion, so thought of something that made you happy, thought of something that made you mad, thought of a previous significant other, that's probably why. Right? Because it didn't get filtered at all by the thalamus. It went straight from nose straight to emotional processing. And we'll talk about the piriform cortex in a minute. All right? So again, it does cheat a little, doesn't go through the thalamus, but other parts do actually go through the thalamus. They do follow that typical pattern, and then they project to the orbitofrontal cortex, and again get processed more like the traditional pattern. So let me show you some of these pictures. I'm going to move them around so I can kind of make them bigger here. So again, stuff came in through the nose, came into the olfactory bulb and got processed. So if you kind of blow it up, here's the olfactory bulb. Some of it went straight to the amygdala, so it didn't even get a chance to go through the thalamus. Other stuff came in and did eventually go to the thalamus before then going towards the orbitofrontal cortex. Right? So again, since a smell kind of cheats. Now, I like this picture a little better, so I'm going to make this one big and show it to you first. All right, so here's your nose. All right, you've got your nasal cavity coming in. Again, the stuff's coming in there. You got your cells, you got your olfactory bulb, and here it is blown up. So here's all the little chemicals that are dissolved in the air. Here's basically the specialized dendrites. They're picking up on it. Here's the specialized axons that will make your olfactory nerve. And here's what we know. So the olfactory receptors send their olfactory nerve into the olfactory bulb. And then the olfactory bulb sends its own tract or its own bundle of nerves into several different places. Right? Some of them go straight to the piriform cortex, the olfactory tubercle, the amygdala. Remember we talked about that was for emotions. The entorhinal cortex. Right? The entorhinal cortex sends it to the hippocampus. Right? Remember we said hippocampus is for memory. This is also why you can remember things that you have smelled. Right? The other, again, will eventually go to the thalamus before going to the orbitofrontal cortex. But notice it didn't go there first. It got processed for emotion first, which is actually why smells can make you feel a certain way. This might be, even though we haven't quite been able to show it scientifically yet, why certain smells might actually have a calming effect. Like some people say they really do feel calm when they light a candle that's a certain smell, like lavender, vanilla, or whatever it might be. Because it could be that either they have trained their brain or something even more cool that we don't understand yet going on about this amygdala that gets activated that then can actually calm you down. All right, so it's actually sending the information about smell in several different pathways, which is, again, probably why smell used to be super important and probably could still be super important. We just don't pay as much attention to it as we do some of our other sensory systems. So another thing that we can actually do that's related to smell but's a little bit different is the idea of pheromones. So pheromones are biochemicals that are released by one animal and act as a chemosignal but affect somebody else. So they affect the physiology or behavior of a different animal. So they're kind of like hormones, but hormones are released in your body and have an effect on your body. Pheromones are released by your body, but have an effect on somebody else's body. Right? We don't typically think of pheromones in people, although people absolutely have pheromones. We typically think of pheromones in other animals, right? Like we think of pheromones when animals go into heat, for example. Things like that. We think of pheromones in like the mother bonding sort of thing. The mom can smell her babies or all, we tend to think of stuff like that. If you've ever seen an animal outside, cats are really notorious for doing it, but snakes can actually do it too. Not that many of you probably sat around and watched a snake do it, but they'll sit there with their mouth open and it looks like they're breathing through their mouth. They're not exactly panting. It's not like a dog who's panting to cool off. what they're actually doing is breathing in a very special way, which lets the air pass over a very special organ called the vomeronasal organ. Sometimes it's called the Jacobson organ, which helps to detect pheromones. And that special behavior that the cats are doing are called phlegming, which I think is a fun word to say. They're phlegming. But basically what they're doing is they're trying to make sure that no other cats have been around in the area, or no other cats have gone into heat, or no other male cats trying to take over their territory, or whatever it is that they're doing. And again, snakes are doing very similar behavior. Again, similar to the idea of smell, but you're not detecting traditional chemicals in the air. You're specifically detecting pheromones with this vomeronasal organ. And again, humans have it too. And humans are particularly acute to it. It's just we don't do a lot of conscious processing of the information that we get from this particular organ. It does send constant information to the amygdala and the hypothalamus, but again, it doesn't go to some of the more conscious parts of our brain, like those higher cortex regions. I actually did this study. Humans are pretty good at knowing things that are behaviorally relevant. Like you can tell if somebody's typically male or female, or you can tell if somebody is in the midst of their menstrual cycle or something like that. Because again, the point of this for some creatures, especially mammals, is helping to find a mate and helping to know if that mate is ready to basically procreate. And I did this experiment in college as part of one of the classes that I was in. I got several of my friends and I bought just one of those generic pack of those white t-shirts. And I had all my friends take what was supposed to be an unscented bar of soap. I had all my friends go, separate bathrooms, but go and take a shower and use that non-scented soap to wash their hair and their upper body and anything else they felt like washing, didn't care. Right? Then they could put on whatever shorts they wanted to put on. And then I had them all put on these white t-shirts. And I told them, I said, don't use any perfume, don't use any hair products, don't use any deodorant, nothing like that. Because the point of this is that I want you to sweat. Right? Then I had everybody run around until their t-shirts got all nice and sweaty. All right? I had them go back inside, change clothes or whatever they wanted to do, and give me their t-shirts that I put into Ziploc bags and sealed them up. Right? And then I wrote a code on the front, it was just A, B, C, D. And then I took them to other people and I said, can you tell me who was wearing this shirt? Can you tell me anything about who was wearing this shirt? And it was surprisingly accurate what people could tell me about who had been wearing the shirt. Like everybody was able to guess who was the male and who was the female, right? Even though if they couldn't tell me why, right? A few people were even able to guess, right, that one of the individuals was older than all of the others. And then a few people were able to guess that one of the individuals, because three of the individuals were white and one of the individuals was Asian, and they were able to guess that difference. And again, if you tried to just smell it with your nose, you couldn't tell the difference. Right? You almost had to like close your eyes and just kind of it feels almost consciously like you're just guessing. But again, what you're really doing is sort of shutting off the conscious part of your brain and letting your pheromones actually speak to you. So it's a really neat thing. But again, humans have not let ourselves be very sensitive to our natural pheromones. We love artificial pheromones. We love to wear stuff like perfume, cologne. We love to wear deodorant. We love to wear all kinds of stuff. Now we've even started putting all that stuff in our laundry detergents and stuff like that, right? Because we think it makes us smell better to ourselves or to the opposite sex or whatever it is that we think that we're trying to do, right? I'm going to attract a mate, right? Or whatever it is. So we use a lot of artificial pheromones. But nonetheless, thought you might find that interesting. Again, you don't need to focus too much on pheromones, just thought you might find that neat. We also have receptors for taste. They're very similar to the ones in your nose. You just find them on your tongue. Within the human species, there are differences in taste thresholds and preferences. So like I was saying with smell, some people have stronger ability to sort of discriminate between smells. Same thing with tastes. Some people are super tasters and they don't like certain tastes like beer or coffee. And then other people are non-tasters. It's really kind of interesting, the difference. There's actually a test that you can do that's a little more formal. It's something called PTC paper. It's these little strips of paper, and you put it on your tongue, and you literally just kind of lick it for a second or two, and you will know right away if you are a taster versus a super taster. Because if you're a super taster, you're going to pull it out of your mouth immediately and go blah, 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 because it's going to be the most nasty, bitter, horrible thing you've ever tasted in your life. If you're a non-taster, which is what I am, you're going to go, yeah, that tasted like paper. Okay, because you don't have that ability to taste that chemical that's on there. And again, we don't know exactly what the difference is between these types of individuals. It's just, we do know that there are differences in sensitivity. And it could be that this is sort of an evolutionary thing, but we haven't completely figured out all of the specifics yet. If you are interested in this sort of stuff, there's a lady by the name of Linda Bartoshuk, and you can look up some of her research. She did a lot of research on this type of thing. But in general, regardless of whether or not you are a taster or, a super taster or a non-taster, you still have at least 5 different taste receptors. And I say at least because there's a lot of new research coming out that there's probably a 6th receptor that's going to get added soon. But for now, we're going to stick with the 5 that are listed. You have receptors that can help you detect things that are sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. And then there's a 5th one that was fairly new called the umami receptor. And again, we don't have an English word for it, so we just call it umami, which was the word that it was given by the group of individuals that discovered it. So we're like, sure, that works. So umami is sensitive to glutamate. And if you remember, glutamate was a neurotransmitter that you may have heard about. But you might find glutamate in certain foods. If you have ever added MSG or seen that your food has MSG in it, monosodium glutamate, that might be what you are tasting, and that might be what sets your umami receptor off, which is why some people might like to add soy sauce, for example, to certain food items, because soy sauce is one of the things that typically has MSG in it, whereas other people don't, because they don't like having that receptor activated in that particular way, that sort of thing. But again, that's it. Your tongue isn't doing a lot of very exciting things, unlike your nose, which can discriminate between tons and tons and tons and tons of different smells. Your taste buds got 5 things going on. That's it. Sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, which is actually pretty boring. But we'll talk about why it's pretty boring and why your brain tricks you into thinking it's not boring in just a second. But let's talk about the taste pathways, and I get to use another one of my favorite words here. They are called the gustatory pathways, which I just think is just a phenomenal word. Gustatory is the fancy word for taste. And these pathways are thanks to some of your cranial nerves, specifically cranial nerves 7, 9, and 10 form the main gustatory nerve. The solitary tract is what it is called. The gustatory region is in the insula, and the insula is actually a little weird spot that separates the frontal lobe and parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. So let me kind of blow it up here so you can sort of see it. So again, you've got frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and then temporal lobe. And again, this is way exaggerated. They've pulled it apart so you can kind of see it. But the insula is kind of what's right in between there. So a lot of times textbooks will say that taste is processed in the temporal lobe. Some will say it's processed in the frontal lobe. It depends on who you ask. Some will say technically they're both right. Some will say they're technically both wrong because it's actually in between all those. I don't care which one you remember. Just know that it's the insula and that the insula is kind of right in between all 3 of those. That's kind of the point of me showing you that. So again, following that pattern, we had the receptors. It is going to eventually get to the brain. That was the primary cortex that I just showed you there. Again, that's the primary somatosensory region. But it's got two things that happen in your mouth, right? So one of the things that happen in your mouth is the taste. The primary, so the primary taste region is the insula. But foods have texture, right? Foods have feeling. So you also are going to have a part of your somatosensory receptor, which if you remember that, all right, let me blow this back up again. Your somatosensory receptor here, and your somatosensory primary cortex, is going to process the texture of your food. So if you've ever been weirded out by how a food felt, right? Are you one of those individuals like, I don't like slimy foods, or I don't like foods that have this kind of texture, right? That actually makes a lot of sense. Why? Because the primary somatosensory region, right, is getting information as well about the tactile information from your mouth, right? So from your tongue particularly, but also some of the other parts of your mouth, about what the food feels like, right? So if the food feels rough, if the food feels bumpy, if the food feels slimy, whatever that might be. So you're getting actually several pieces of information. One of them is legitimately taste. The other one is actually a touch sensation. So the gustatory information is going to go to the orbital cortex eventually. It's going to be a mixture again of olfactory and gustatory input. So notice what I said there. Right? By the time it gets to the orbital cortex, it's mixed with our sense of smell, and that is what gives rise to our perception of flavor. So again, I told you earlier smell was pretty boring. Yeah, taste is pretty boring. Yeah, it's pretty boring. Salty, sweet, sour, bitter, umami. That's it. Right? So when you're eating something sweet, how do you know if it's sweet apple? How do you know if it's sweet peach? How do you know if it's sweet strawberry? How do you know if it's bubble gum? Well, you don't until it gets here and it mixes with the input from your sense of smell. This is why when you have a cold or something like that and your nose is all congested and you can't smell very good, that's why your food tastes so boring, right? Because it is boring. Because again, you're only getting little tiny bits of information about your food. You're getting information about how the food feels and information about whether or not it's sweet, salty, bitter, sour, or umami. You're not getting anything else. Again, you don't get any of the other cool parts about your food until it mixes with how it smells. So this is why they tell you to eat really slowly and let the food kind of linger in your mouth, because then that gives it a chance a little bit longer to have sent some of the chemical up into your sinuses so that you can smell it and you get the full effect of the food. And the full effect is the combination of the taste part and the smell part. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, that's where I'm going to stop the end of this first lecture. I had two more pictures I wanted to show you, though, about some of this information. The first one, first let me do this one first. This is an actual picture of the brain itself. So let me move some other ones here so you can see what I got going on. All right, so again, you got incoming information from those cranial nerves. All right, they are going to go through. It is going to still be processed by the amygdala. It is going to still go through the thalamus, right? And it is going to then be processed again in two ways. You do have the gustatory cortex, which is the insula. That's the part that's actually processing the taste part. But then it's also going to be processed for texture. That's the feeling part over in the primary somatosensory cortex. Right, so it kind of splits itself up. And again, that's the job of the thalamus, is to send touch information here, taste information here. So again, that's why we had that thalamus. All right, then the last one that I wanted to show you is, again, this is just how my brain works. I like to see it all kind of laid out. All right, you got several different cranial nerves. And again, you don't need to remember the cranial nerves. Just note there were several. Right? Some of the cranial nerves are bringing us information from different parts of our taste buds, different parts of our tongue and mouth. All of that comes together, ultimately sent to the brainstem. Right? Some of it, again, cheats, goes straight to the amygdala and the hypothalamus. Again, this part I'm coming up to in the next lecture, why that's so important. But some of it will go to the thalamus, the VPN of the thalamus. and then ultimately, again, to the insula and the frontal cortex, depending on, again, whether or not it's strictly taste or whether or not it's texture. So again, sometimes I like to see things written out like that. So hopefully that makes sense, and I will talk to you in the next lecture.